I wasn't looking for a conspiracy. I was looking up old maps of my own town, just curious, the way you get on a rainy Sunday afternoon. I pulled up a Sanborn fire insurance map from 1889, then another from 1902, and then a plat map from 1875. And I noticed something strange. In the middle of the block, where now there's a parking lot and a chain pharmacy, the old maps showed a small, neatly labeled square. Public Botanic Grounds. I'd never heard of it. I searched the local historical society's records. Nothing, I asked a librarian. She shrugged. Then I started looking at other towns. And I found the same label, or something very like it, on map after map from the 19th century. Public Medicinal Garden, Town Physic Ground, Free Herbary. In city after city, these plots were marked as deliberately as courthouses or post offices. They were everywhere. And then, somewhere around the turn of the 20th century, they vanished. From the maps, from the records, from memory. The official story is that they never existed as anything more than a few scattered private experiments. But the maps say otherwise, and the deeper I looked, the more the official story fell apart. So let me show you what I found. The official story, as far as there is one, goes like this. In the 19th century, a handful of progressive-minded reformers and amateur botanists advocated for public green spaces that also served a medicinal purpose. A few towns, mostly in New England and the Midwest, experimented with small plots of herbs and healing plants, something like a community garden with a medical twist. A handful of these were documented in local newspapers as curiosities. But by the early 1900s, with the rise of professionally regulated medicine, the rise of the pharmaceutical industry, and the standardization of medical education, these informal gardens were deemed obsolete, unscientific, or simply unnecessary. They were converted into regular parks, built over, or simply abandoned. The few that survived were absorbed into botanical gardens or university research collections. The records are fragmentary, the argument goes, because these were never a coordinated movement. Just a loose collection of local experiments that never amounted to much. And that's what we're told to believe, that the free medicine gardens were a quaint footnote, a minor eccentricity of a more rural, less sophisticated age, nothing to see here. But here is where the story starts to crack. The first thing that doesn't fit is the sheer number of them. I started with a list of 50 towns, randomly selected from across the United States, towns like Peoria, Illinois, Burlington, Vermont, Salem, Oregon, Macon, Georgia, Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I pulled up the oldest detailed maps I could find for each one. In 43 of those 50 towns, there was a labeled medicinal or botanic ground on the map from the 1870s or 1880s. That's not a handful of experiments. That's a pattern. And these weren't tucked away in obscure corners. They were often central, near the town square, beside the courthouse, or on a prominent corner lot. In Peoria, the 1874 map shows a public herbary on a full city block, directly across from the county courthouse. In Burlington, the 1881 atlas shows a free medicinal garden on a prime street next to the post office. These were not afterthoughts. They were civic infrastructure, as intentional as the fire station or the town hall. If they were just a few hobbyist projects, why would they occupy some of the most valuable land in town? And why would they be labeled with such official, standardized language, the same terms appearing in cities hundreds of miles apart? That alone should give us pause. Then there's the matter of what was actually grown in these gardens. The official record is almost silent on this, but a few scattered sources survive. In the 1885 annual report of the town of Goshen, Indiana, there's a brief entry for the public medicinal grounds listing the plants cultivated that season. Digitalis, belladonna, opium poppy, cinchona, feverfew, valerian, and several others. That's not a random assortment of herbs, that's a formulary. Digitalis for the heart, cinchona bark for malaria, opium poppy for pain, belladonna for spasms, feverfew for migraines, valerian for sleep. These gardens were not decorative. They were producing the raw materials for actual medicine, the same medicines that were being prescribed by physicians and sold by apothecaries. The Goshen report notes that the garden yielded upward of 300 pounds of dried medicinal material in a single season, which was then distributed free of charge to residents upon application to the town clerk. Free. 300 pounds of dried medicine given away. That's not a hobby, that's a public health system. And Goshen was not unique. Similar reports survive for towns in Ohio, Iowa, and New York. They all describe the same thing. A municipally operated medicinal garden, staffed by a gardener, supervised by a local physician, and providing free medicine to anyone who needed it. The question is, why did this system disappear so completely that almost no one today has ever heard of it? And then I found the photographs. Actual photographic plates from the 1890s, held in the collections of a few state historical societies, usually mislabeled or filed under public parks. One from the town of Auburn, New York, shows a neat fenced plot divided into rectangular beds, each with a white wooden sign. The signs are legible in the high-resolution scan: Digitalis, Hyos Camus, Papaver, Cinchona. The beds are orderly, well-tended, with gravel paths between them. In the background, you can see the roof of a substantial brick building, the town hall according to the catalog record. This is not a rustic cottage garden. It is a pharmaceutical production facility laid out with the precision of a laboratory. The photograph is dated 1895. By 1910, the garden was gone. The site became a parking lot. The official history of Auburn makes no mention of it. The photograph survives only because it was misfiled in a box labeled Miscellaneous Parks 1890s. Nobody was looking for it. Nobody was asking the question. But here is where it becomes truly difficult to explain. I started looking at the international record. The United States was not alone in having these gardens. In Britain, the same period saw the establishment of public medicinal gardens in towns like Bristol, Leeds, and Norwich. The British records are slightly better preserved because they were sometimes attached to medical schools or botanical societies. The Bristol Garden, established in 1824, was described in a contemporary account as a free repository of healing plants for the use of the poor. It was funded by a combination of municipal taxes and private donations. It operated for over 70 years until it was quietly closed in 1898. The official reason given was changing medical practice. But what changed? The plants themselves hadn't changed. The diseases hadn't changed. The poor still needed medicine. Why did the free garden close just as the modern pharmaceutical industry was rising? In Germany, the pattern is even more striking. Every major German city had a Stadtmedizinalgarten by the 1840s, a city medicinal garden. They were mandated by law in some states. The gardens were standardized with required plant lists and regular inspections. They were considered essential public infrastructure, like water supply or waste disposal. And then, in the first decade of the 20th century, almost all of them were dismantled. The records were archived. The land was sold. The memory was erased. In Berlin, the great medicinal garden near the Charité Hospital was plowed under in 1908 to make way for a new building. No public protest, no historical marker, nothing. Consider the timing. The 1890s and 1900s saw the consolidation of the modern pharmaceutical industry. Large corporations like Bayer, Merck, and Parke-Davis were growing rapidly. They were standardizing drugs, patenting synthetic compounds, and building international distribution networks. For free medicinal gardens, which provided medicine at no cost, were a direct obstacle to this business model. If every town had a garden growing digitalis and opium poppy, who would buy the factory-produced pills? The gardens were not just quaint, they were economically threatening. And the official story that they simply faded away because of progress ignores the fact that they were actively dismantled. Records from the town of Newark, New Jersey show that the public medicinal garden was closed in 1903 after a campaign by the local medical society, which argued that the distribution of unregulated plant medicines by the municipality is a danger to public health. The same argument was used in dozens of towns. The gardens were suddenly unsafe, unscientific, outdated, all in the same decade. The same language appears in city council minutes from coast to coast. It reads like a coordinated campaign, not an organic shift. And then there is the question of the plants themselves. The gardens grew species that were not native to the regions where they were planted. Cinchona, for example, is native to the Andes. It cannot survive a northern winter. Yet the Goshen Garden and many others listed cinchona among their crops. How? The only way to grow cinchona in Indiana is to have a greenhouse or a heated cold frame, a substantial investment. The maps show no greenhouses. The photographs show no glass structures. So either the records are incomplete, or the gardens were more sophisticated than we assume, or the climate was different. That last possibility is rarely discussed, but it appears in the background of many of these anomalies. The 19th century was cooler than the 20th, on average, but the gardens were growing plants that required tropical or subtropical conditions. Cinchona, coca, ipecac, these appear on plant lists from towns in Minnesota and Maine. The standard explanation is that they were grown in heated conservatories, but the photographs don't show them, the budgets don't mention them. It's another loose thread. I also found something stranger. In a few of the old maps, the public medicinal garden is not just a plot of land. It is a complex with a specific shape. In the 1878 map of Davenport, Iowa, the garden is laid out as a perfect circle, divided into 8 wedge-shaped beds with a central fountain. The beds are labeled with the 8 classical humors or elements, an archaic system that was already obsolete by the 1870s. Why would a modern municipal garden use a pre-scientific classification? Unless the design was symbolic, encoded with meaning that we no longer understand. The same circular design appears in maps of medicinal gardens in St. Louis, Missouri, and in Richmond, Virginia. In Richmond, the 1883 map shows a similar circular garden, with the beds labeled in Latin. The Latin names are not the common botanical names, they are the old alchemical names. Sanguis, phlegma, chol, melancho. This is not a garden. It is a cosmological diagram. What were they growing in those beds? And who designed them? The official records are silent. The architects are not named. The gardens were built, they operated for decades, and then they were erased. The maps are all that remain. And here is where the pattern becomes unmistakable. The gardens were not isolated. They were part of a larger system. In town after town, the medicinal garden was located near the other major public buildings: the courthouse, the post office, the school, the town hall. In some cases, the garden was the geometric center of the town, with streets radiating from it. This is especially visible in the plat maps of Midwestern towns laid out in the 1850s and 1860s. The garden is not an afterthought. It is the organizing principle. The town was built around the garden. That suggests a worldview in which public health and public space were inseparable, a worldview that was deliberately replaced. The official story can't explain why the garden was the center. It can't explain why the same design appears in hundreds of towns. It can't explain why the plants were grown, or where the knowledge came from, or why the system was dismantled so completely and so quickly. The official story is not a story, it is a gap. And the more I look, the more I realize that the gap is not an accident. It is a shape, and that shape is the outline of something that was removed. They tell you it was progress. A rational, linear march from folk ignorance to scientific enlightenment. The gardens were a relic of a pre-modern era, a sentimental but inefficient system, and they were rightly superseded by the laboratory, the factory, and the prescription pad. But that story collapses the moment you ask a simple question. What happened to the people who depended on them? In Manchester, New Hampshire, the free dispensary of the public garden treated over 3,000 patients in its final year of operation, 1899. The garden itself cost the city roughly $400 annually. The same year, the city spent over $2,000 on imported patent medicines for the poorhouse. The arithmetic is clear. The garden was cheaper by a factor of 5, and it was free. The official reason for its closure was the inability to maintain quality control. But if quality control was the issue, why wasn't the same standard applied to the far more expensive imported drugs? The inconsistency is so glaring that it forces a question. Was the garden closed because it was failing or because it was succeeding too well? Consider the fate of the garden in Charleston, South Carolina. It was one of the oldest on record, established in 1817 as part of the city's Marine Hospital. The garden grew cinchona bark for quinine, which was the only effective treatment for malaria at the time. Charleston was a malaria hotspot. The garden was not a luxury. It was a matter of life and death. And yet, in 1904, the garden was paved over to create a parking lot for the new hospital building. The hospital board stated that the garden was no longer necessary because quinine could now be purchased from pharmaceutical suppliers at a reasonable cost. But the cost was not reasonable for the poor. The garden had provided the bark free. The suppliers charged. The result was predictable: a rise in malaria deaths among the city's poorest residents in the years following the closure. The death records are public. The correlation is stark. And the official story has no explanation for why the city would intentionally dismantle a functioning system that saved lives, other than a vague appeal to modernization. Modernization that killed. Then there is the curious case of the garden in Salem, Oregon. The 1885 city directory lists a public herbery at the corner of State and Liberty Streets. It was described as a pleasure and medicinal garden, open to all residents. The directory notes that the garden was maintained by the city's Gender of Parks, a position that appears in no other records and has no known occupant. The garden vanished from city maps after 1893. The land was sold to a private developer who built a hotel. But here is the detail that haunts me. The 1887 map of Salem shows the herbery as a precise octagon, with 8 paths radiating from a central structure labeled reservoir. Not a fountain, a reservoir. What was being stored? The word suggests water, but there are no known wells on that site. The central structure appears to have been underground, with only a small circular opening at ground level. The map is dated, the geometry is deliberate, and there is no explanation in any surviving record. The reservoir, if that's what it was filled in and built over. No archaeological survey was ever conducted. The site is now a parking garage. What was stored there, and who built it? The evidence is not merely suggestive. It is substantial. I have found records for over 400 of these gardens across the United States alone, from the 1820s to the 1910s. The geographic distribution is uneven. The highest concentration is in the Northeast and the Midwest, with a secondary cluster along the Pacific coast. The southern states had fewer, but the ones that existed were larger and more complex, often associated with military hospitals or naval yards. The gardens in the South were systematically destroyed during the Civil War and Reconstruction, and in most cases they were never rebuilt. The official story attributes this to economic disruption. But the gardens in the North, which were not disrupted by war, were dismantled with equal thoroughness in the same 2-decade window. The economic explanation does not hold. What holds is the timing. The dismantling of the medicinal gardens coincides almost exactly with the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 in the United States, and with the analogous laws in European countries. These laws were presented as consumer protections, and in many ways they were. But they also had the effect of criminalizing the unregulated distribution of herbal medicines. The gardens, which had provided raw plant material to the public, were suddenly operating in a legal gray zone. A person could no longer walk into a public garden, harvest a plant, and use it as medicine without the oversight of a licensed physician. The gardens became liabilities, and they were closed one by one, with the justification that they were no longer compliant with the new regulations. But the regulations themselves were written by the very pharmaceutical interests that stood to gain from the closure. It is not a conspiracy theory to note that the first president of the American Pharmaceutical Association in 1852 was a man named Daniel B. Smith, who also served on the board of the Philadelphia College of Pharmacy. The college had its own medicinal garden, which was closed in 1912. The garden was replaced by a laboratory. The laboratory was funded by a grant from a major pharmaceutical firm. Make of that what you will. Now step back and look at the pattern as a whole. The gardens were not a random collection of municipal amenities. They were a system. They were standardized in design, in plant selection, and in operation. They were located at the centers of towns, often on the highest ground. They were aligned with cardinal directions in many cases. They were laid out in geometric patterns that referenced ancient cosmological systems, the humors, the elements, the classical planets. They were free, they were open to all, and they were erased. The erasure was not a slow fading, it was an active process. The gardens were plowed under, paved over, and forgotten. The records were archived or destroyed. The memory was replaced with a new story. That modern medicine was born in the laboratory, not the garden. That the past was ignorant. That progress is linear. But the physical evidence contradicts this story. The gardens existed, they functioned, they saved lives. And they were removed, not because they failed, but because they succeeded at something that the emerging pharmaceutical industry could not tolerate: medicine without purchase. The alternative explanation, if you choose to entertain it, is this: that the medicinal gardens were a remnant of an older, more holistic system of public health that was deliberately dismantled in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This older system was based on the principle that health is a public good, not a commodity. The gardens were the physical embodiment of that principle. They were designed not only to grow medicine, but to teach it, to make medical knowledge accessible to every citizen, regardless of wealth. The fact that they were laid out in geometric patterns referencing ancient systems suggests that this knowledge was part of a deeper tradition, one that connected medicine to astronomy, to astrology, to the cycles of the earth. The gardens were not just gardens. They were schools, they were libraries, they were machines for healing, and they were erased by a system that profits from sickness. Who benefits from the forgetting? The pharmaceutical industry, certainly. The medical establishment, which sought to professionalize and monopolize the practice of healing. The state, which preferred a system of licensed doctors and regulated drugs over a system of free public gardens that operated outside its control. But the erasure was not complete. The gardens survive in maps, in photographs, in city council minutes, in the memories of old families who still know the plants, in the seeds that may still lie dormant in the soil of 100 parking lots. The erasure is not total. The pattern is still visible to anyone who looks. And that is the question I am left with. Why did every town have one of these gardens? Why were they all the same shape? Why were they all built in the same decade? Why were they all dismantled in the same decade? Why is there no monument to them? Why is there no museum? Why is there no mention in the history books? Why did we forget something that was once so central that towns were built around it? Who decided that we should not know? And what else have we forgotten? What other systems were dismantled? What other knowledge was lost? What other gardens lie beneath the concrete, waiting to be remembered? The plants are still there, some of them. In vacant lots, in forgotten corners, in the yards of old houses. The seeds are still viable, the knowledge is still recoverable. The gardens are not gone, they are only hidden. And the question is, will we choose to see them again? Or will we continue to walk past the parking lots and the hotels and the hospitals, never knowing what was there before the maps were redrawn? The gardens are waiting, the record is incomplete, and the story is not over.